Throughout American history, as cities expanded, so did the complexities of poverty. By the mid-19th century, it was difficult to distinguish between a person's genuine need and whose vice was just being enabled. It was estimated that 3/4 or more of those impoverished were because of intemperance. Solving poverty required a considerable amount of relationship. Many Christian societies would form, and eventually America's first gospel rescue mission was established in New York City in 1872. The needs of the poor were met, and the gospel was preached daily, which would help provide the moral values needed to lift a person out of their plight. Dozens of missions sprang up throughout the U.S., creating a new genre of ministry. In 1906, the International Union of Gospel Missions came into existence, establishing connection and accountability. In 1924, Peter Quartel, founder of the Dayton Rescue Mission and representative of the IUGM, visited Cincinnati. He was surprised to discover that there was no gospel mission in a city of 500,000 people. He called upon a number of Christian leaders in the city, including James N. Gamble of Procter & Gamble, who would serve as the board's first president. Gamble financed a building, and on August 4th of 1924, City Gospel Mission opened the doors for its first service with 29 people in attendance. The mission would hold services every night of the year and would serve the poor throughout the city, including hundreds of children. Superintendents would step in and out, giving years of service to the community. But in 1942, the board struggled to find a good fit after several false starts. That same year, a Miss Margaret Khan was hired for office work, and it was quickly realized that nobody could run the mission like her. The board voted to make her the next executive director, and for a woman, that was very unheard of at the time.
And I'm telling you, when they elected me superintendent of that mission, even the IUGM, they would have nothing to do with me because I was a woman. I had no business in mission work. Now they'd hire a man and his wife would help out. That was okay, but a woman, never. And I had letters from a lot of those men telling me that they never thought I could do it. I don't think there are very many women that would go through what I went through with.
It wasn't her goal, but Marguerite was pioneering women's rights in a world dominated by white men. It even took decades for the IUGM to officially acknowledge her as superintendent. But she stayed the course simply because of her love for Jesus and the poor she served. In 1943, City Gospel Mission acquired a Presbyterian church on Elm Street. It was a traditional mission which in those days included a small apartment above the chapel where the minister and his family could live. Marguerite moved in and immediately made changes.
The day that I went in there with the keys, I opened that door and I thought, oh my goodness, what have I got myself in? It was back on Vine Street. Anybody come in wanted a meal, and Reverend Linville would sit with his feet on the desk all day. He'd go down his pocket and pull out a quarter, hand it to him, and he'd quote them a little bit of scripture if they wanted a bottle of wine or whatever. Didn't make any difference to him. He got rid of it. The very first thing I did, I said, no more money. I bought a roll of bologna and a loaf of bread, and that's what I gave him. Well, the first thing you know, I had a meal program.
Okay, so you actually started that. Before you, they didn't really serve meals there.
No, they just gave everybody quarters.
Just gave everybody quarters, told them to go on else.
Throughout America, most drugs were still being explored medicinally. And while opium was legal and popular, nothing was as widely distributed as alcohol. Segregation had a firm grasp on the nation, and redlining forced minorities into isolated communities, creating cities within cities. Unfortunately, segregation permeated the churches as well. So in those days, the mission predominantly served middle-aged white drunks, men who were generally skilled but couldn't hold down their jobs because of the bottle. Marguerite kept the chapel doors open 24/7 for the public. The men would make repairs to the church, sleep in the pews, and get up early to find work. The mission continued to serve children as well. They held summer camps and a Sunday Bible school that grew to 400 children in attendance. In 1944, Marguerite started the Women's Auxiliary of City Gospel Mission. They were an important group of women, influential and well-connected with the local churches. Their first goal was simple: to raise money for a China set that could serve 100 people. From there, the initiatives would quickly grow, helping the mission to scale over the coming years. After World War II, America began to change dramatically. Amazingly, the West End of Cincinnati was a thriving hub for African Americans. The community provided everything Black families migrating from the South could want. But in the 50s, I-75 was cut through the West End, destroying Black economic development, an act that displaced 10,000 Black families. Through the 60s, the civil rights movement would fight for equality in the courts. The Vietnam War brought back heroin-addicted soldiers, and drugs would be experimented with in ways never before seen throughout America. Federal drug laws would lead to an imbalance of incarcerated minorities, what we define today as the new Jim Crow laws. Welfare changed, providing incentives that would arguably break families apart. And mental health was becoming deinstitutionalized, which would introduce a new demographic into the homeless population. The definition of poverty was changing rapidly. Missions around the nation were now running drug and alcohol recovery programs. Marguerite worked hard to raise funds for a new building that could house transient men. The building was completed in 1971, but unfortunately, Marguerite began experiencing health issues that same year. She hired a new director who began to pressure her to move out of the apartment above the chapel. After 30 years of service, Marguerite would retire. The 70s and 80s would be a challenging time for the mission. The neighborhood around the campus declined and became dangerous. Internally, the mission would also decline. At 81 years old, Marguerite was invited back to visit her beloved mission.
Everything was wrong. It was the dirtiest. He did nothing, absolutely nothing. The place, the papers were scattered, everything was moved around. All the files was out in the hall. The doors were locked, and he took out all those benches.
Yeah, we have a picture of that. I wondered about that. The church pews, now we have folding chairs.
My heart was just broken. I said, you know what I do? The first thing I do, I unlock these doors. That's the worst thing in this world for a mission, is to lock it up. It just broke my heart.
Board members would ask why African Americans weren't engaged with any of the programs. The blacks just aren't interested, the director would reply, but the reality was that racism had permeated the mission's programming. In 1989, a period of 6 days had gone by and no one had seen the superintendent. A member of the board decided to check on the apartment above the chapel. There he found the executive director passed out on a recliner. Beer cans were piled to the windowsills and mountains of liquor bottles were discovered in the attic. The mission had officially reached its lowest point. In 1992, the board would hire Ed Perrine, who had experience working at missions in LA and Chicago. Ed worked hard to help the mission rise out of the mire, but the staff he inherited were ultimately thieving, lazy, and dirty. Eventually, they'd either quit or be let go. Ed prayed for help, and God provided. His staff would be replaced with passionate people who had a love for Jesus and the work of the mission. God would bring restoration to the mission under Ed's care. Unfortunately, the children's ministry, along with the women's auxiliary, had all but vanished under the directors of the 70s and 80s. But God had a plan for the youth of the city during that time as well. In 1978, Roger Howell moved from Michigan to join Cincinnati's Youth for Christ. 2 years in, the organization faced financial catastrophe and Roger took over as the executive director. After 3 years of hard work, he rebuilt the organization to 4 full-time staff. His work caught the attention of city leaders, and Roger was asked to take on another struggling nonprofit for youth. In '92, Roger would merge the 2 programs and name the organization City Cure. Through those years, ministry leaders would become acquainted with each other and additional mergers would take place. In '92, Roger would meet Gordon Havens. Gordon had started a Christian rap team for inner city youth. His work shared the same vision as City Cure. So in '93, Gordon would merge his ministry with City Cure. 10 years later, they would start Princess's Ballet with sites all across the city. Through the 90s, Ed would raise funding that took the organization to over $1 million. Racism was virtually eliminated and the building was occupied by men of all color. In '97, Ed would meet Lakrita Bowman. Lakrita founded Having the Courage to Change, a ministry serving women coming out of prison and into recovery. They realized that they shared the same vision, and in '98, Lakrita merged Having the Courage to Change with City Gospel Mission. During the '90s, Ed also became familiar with Roger and the work of City Cure. With a goal to minimize the duplication of infrastructure, Ed approached Roger. And in 2001, City Gospel Mission and City Cure would merge under the umbrella name of City Ministries. The organization could now serve men, women, and children throughout Cincinnati collectively. Prayerfully, it was decided that Roger would serve as the executive director and Ed would support Roger until his retirement in 2006. At the time, churches and social programming were still largely siloed and racially divided throughout the city. City Ministries would break down barriers by creating a structure for volunteers to become the backbone of the ministry. Churches that would typically never meet began doing ministry together throughout the organization. With the expansion of ministry and mergers over the years, the organization's branding became confusing. So in 2009, the board voted to rebrand all of the ministries under one name, City Gospel Mission, and the mission became very clear: to break the cycle of poverty and despair, one life at a time. During the rebranding, the revitalization of downtown Cincinnati was underway. The mission had outgrown its home on Elm Street, and the pressure was on to find a new location. 3CDC was the organization responsible for the city's transformation. They partnered with City Gospel Mission to develop a capital campaign that raised $15 million for the relocation. They found a spot on Dalton Avenue, formerly known as Crosley Field, the historic Red Stadium. Everyone was excited for the new move, and then the lawsuits started to hit. The businesses in Queensgate didn't want the mission around. Roger and the leadership team worked with passion and humility to educate the city, and after 5 years of fighting lawsuits and zoning permits, they didn't just win the case, they won the heart of the city. State and local dignitaries, along with members of the entire community, showed up for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The facilities that were built were world-class, and for the cherry on top, they won the favor of the businesses next door. During the move to Dalton Avenue, Jobs Plus and Hope House Ministries would merge with City Gospel Mission. In 2017, the organization had reached 100 employees. During the COVID-19 pandemic, leadership made it clear that they were not giving up on the poor. They came up with innovative ways to shelter their guests. In 2022, after 3 decades of ministry, Roger Howell would retire. In 2023, Dr. Jonathan Brown would step in and become the mission's first African-American president, ushering in a new era for City Gospel Mission. History has proven that the best way to handle the complexities of poverty is through relationship and compassion. The organization has never been more equipped to meet the needs of the poor with the love of Jesus. And through the next century, we will continue to break the cycle of poverty and despair, one life at a time.